Thank you so much to Jorge for being here. Let me read the bio that we have so I can say something clever. Jorge Arango brings clarity and alignment to UX and systems design projects by using architectural thinking. Over the past 25 years, he has architected digital experiences and made the complex clear for all sorts of organizations, from nonprofits to Fortune 500 corporations. He's the author of Living in Information, Responsible Design for Digital Places, Two Waves Books, 2018, and co-author of Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond, O'Reilly Media, 2015, also known as the Polar Bear Book. In addition to his design consulting practice, Jorge also writes a blog, hosts a podcast, and teaches systems design in the Graduate Interaction Design program at the California College of Arts in San Francisco. So I'll get myself out of here, and if you have questions, get them in the chat room and we'll look at them later, but go, go, go.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you everyone for being here. Like we were saying right before we got started here, I'm always excited to talk with folks about information architecture. Like Debbie was saying, this is a subject that more folks should know about. And just by the mere fact that you are here, I think that you've at least been exposed to the phrase information architecture. And that places you in, I think, a small fraction of the overall population who has even heard the phrase, right? But if you are like most people who have heard about information architecture, I think it's very likely that you think of information architecture as something that looks kind of like this. That is something like a sitemap, right? And I've had clients ask me to send them the IA, right? And when they say send me the IA, they mean send me something that looks kind of like this. In fact, if you Google information architecture in the Google image search, you will find that most of the results that come back are artifacts that look like sitemaps. So I believe that there's this popular conception of information architecture as a sitemap. And while sitemaps are certainly an important artifact in the process of defining an information architecture, there's more to IA than just making sitemaps. And the focus of this presentation is to perhaps reframe for you at a very high level what information architecture is about, hopefully so that you can then do more explorations of the subject on your own. And I believe that it's extremely important that we do so, like we were saying earlier. And the reason for this is that software is eating the world. And you might have heard this phrase. It comes from an opinion piece that Mark Andreessen published in the Wall Street Journal a decade ago. So it's been a while, right? And I'm not going to read the long quote, but the gist of it is that we're in the midst of this transformation where so many of the things that we do and interact with in our world are becoming software. And the picture here, I'm of a vintage where it used to be that music, if you wanted to buy music so you could listen to it at home, you would have to go to a store that looked kind of like the one in the photograph, right? And these days, if you want to listen to music, that's all happening in the cloud, right? So you just open something like Spotify or Apple Music and you start streaming music, and you don't have to go to a physical place to peruse aisles and look for these categories of CDs or albums or whatever to get your music. And this transformation that we're undergoing has many advantages. So we have access to more information than anyone has ever had in the history of our species, right? And you can pull it up at any moment, pretty much anywhere. You have this computer in your pocket that is connected to the web and allows you to peruse all this stuff on a moment's notice. And that's fantastic, right? But we have to acknowledge that there are also challenges that come with this change. For one thing, we are now having to look for stuff in bigger haystacks. So the physical record store was constrained by physical limitations, right? Like the store could only be so big. It could only have an inventory of a limited size. And and the way that the information was organized in the store was also limited by the fact that the records couldn't sit in more than one place in the shelves or the counters. And now all of those things are up in the air, right? So we have so much more stuff, and the haystacks are bigger, and it might be potentially harder to find what you're looking for. And that leads to a condition that's been called information overload, where you have too much stuff to process, and leading to another phrase you might have heard, decision paralysis, right? So where you have so many options that you don't know what to do, and it can potentially be confusing, right? So information architecture traditionally has helped alleviate this problem. But there's one other aspect to this that is worth calling out, which is that we are undergoing a loss of context as we move more and more of our interactions online. And information architecture addresses these issues by making information easier to find and understand. And it's important to differentiate those two, because finding has to do with locating the item that you're looking for, right? Like, and first of all, like identifying what you're looking for, and then locating it within the data set, whether you're talking about a digital data set or something like the record store. But the other key part to this is understanding what you're looking at. And it's important that we acknowledge that we understand things in the context that we encounter them. And we'll talk a bit more about this. But anyways, information architecture does this. That is, it enables our ability to find and understand things by defining conceptual structures that offer meaningful distinctions to people. And we'll talk a bit more about that as well. But it's important to acknowledge that when I say meaningful distinctions, distinctions are meaningful within particular contexts. So the record store is a particular type of context. And if you encounter an item in the context of that store, you will understand it differently than if you encounter it in a different place. And this stuff feels like it's very obvious, and it is, because that's how we've been interacting in physical environments for a long time, only that now we're having to do it in these digital environments. So I'll speak more to that, but first I'll offer up a very high level definition of what information architecture is. And this is one of several definitions that you will find in the Polar Bear book, but it's my favorite of the bunch. I think the one that we should be paying special attention to. And it says that information architecture is the structural design of shared information environments. So that says nothing about a sitemap. It says nothing about wireframes, right? It's the structural design. And the structural design might be expressed as a sitemap. It might be expressed as a wireframe, but it's more than that, right? And what we mean by shared information environments is that we are creating contexts in which people find and understand information. And like I said, information is only meaningful within contexts. And conversely, contexts layer meaning on top of information. And I'll illustrate what I mean by showing you a physical place. All right. And here is where I will ask you to unmute yourself if you want to speak up, but I'll ask anyone here if you care to guess what this place is, this place on the photograph. So you're welcome to speak up or post it on the chat. I can't see if you're, so someone says a cafe, all right? And why a restaurant? right? So why would you guess that this is a cafe, restaurant, hotel? What leads you to believe that just from what you're seeing here?
Chairs, placemats, glasses, groupings of chairs.
Right. There's placemaps. There's these groupings with chairs around them, right? Folks in the chat saying the way tables are set up with the cups and placemats, the layout of the tables and chairs, right? Um, yes, Jehan, I hope I pronounced your name right. The exit signs indicate that it's a public space, right? So you know that this is not a private home because private homes don't have exit signs like those, right? And I wanna delve a little bit on those exit signs because there are what you're all bringing up here is the fact that this environment is not only giving us opportunities to do certain activities, right? Like it's set up for us to do certain things by the arrangement of furniture, the layout of the place, and the objects that we find there, right? Like they enable certain activities, and you could say they discourage others. But it also sends us visual cues that that let us know that that is the type of place that this is, and you're expected to do certain things there, and you're discouraged from doing certain things there. And especially now, during the pandemic, we've gotten used to the fact that if we are in an environment like this, we're going to want to keep some distance from other people, right? And that's a newly acquired behavior for interacting in this sort of environment. And in fact, when I look at this photo now, when I built this presentation before the pandemic, this felt very normal to me. But now when I look at this picture, it feels a little crowded, right? And that's just visual information that the environment is giving me. The environment also suggests where I might go, right? Like, so there are openings on the wall. I can see that there's a source of natural light, which suggests that there's an opening to the outside. And there's an opening on the right that is darker. So I assume that that leads further into the space. And moreover, those ways for me to move around are labeled. So they explicitly say exit, right? So there's these explicit clues that the environment is sending us. And then there are these other subtler clues that let us know what type of place we're in. And like I said, we're expected to behave in certain ways here. And we have expectations about how we might interact and how we might be served here. Now I'm going to flip this and ask if you might guess what type of place this is. And I've covered up the branding here and also made it monochrome because if I left the colors, then you might guess what business this is. But just from looking at this, what would you say it is? So Charlene says it's a banking site, and Paris is more specific. It says the Bank of America, and I'm curious, Paris, why you would be able to guess that it's that particular bank. While you do that, I'll just say that industry experience, right? But my point in showing this, and I'm glad that that y'all were able to get it relatively quickly, right? And this just goes to show that the language that we use in things like navigation bars and form elements and stuff like that, much like the physical place we were looking at, these labels that we're using here create a particular type of context. And if you say, well, I am now in the context of a bank, you have expectations as to what you can and cannot do there, right? So for example, for me, one of the expectations when interacting in a bank's website is that there's going to be some place where I can cross over from the public part of the environment, the kind of marketing site, over to a more private part of the environment where I can, if I'm a customer, I can do things like check my accounts, transfer money, pay my credit cards, that sort of thing. And much like we bring expectations to the sort of service that a restaurant will provide us, we bring expectations to the sort of service that a website like this one will offer us. And whenever we're designing a website or an app or any kind of digital system, we have to come to terms with the fact that the people who are going to be using this thing are going to have expectations that are set perhaps by their previous experiences, but also by cultural norms, by legal frameworks. There's a bunch of contextual issues that you're dealing with. And a lot of that context gets expressed through the information architecture. So the key when designing this is figuring out how people understand the domain that they're operating within and how they expect to find things there and what they expect to be able to do there, right? So when we're creating these meaningful distinctions, we aim to create choices that match or slightly tweak the understanding of the people who come to the environment, right? So if they come to a bank, they have a mental model, and that mental model precedes even the existence of bank websites, right? Like a bank is an institution that might extend loans, and that's an expectation that they're going to bring to this. And if your banking environment doesn't provide that, doesn't match that expectation, you have you have a gap, right? And you have to somehow compensate for that gap. And it's just important to acknowledge that. And the way that we go about understanding that gap is by doing research. And I'm glad that Joshua's presentation prior to this one dealt with this aspect of information architecture, so that I don't have to go in depth into it. But basically, before we start designing these sets of structural distinctions, we must understand the problem space that we're dealing with. And we look at it through this lens where we're trying to grok the business context in which the system is going to be working, right? What is the business context for banking? Well, there's all these things, right? Like there's regulation, there's the infrastructure that the organization has in place. There are the goals of the team that is managing this thing, right? There are competitors who are using particular language, and those shape the mental models that our users bring to the experience. And that's another part that we must research. We must research the users. What are their goals and needs? What do they want out of the interaction? What is their level of understanding of the domain? And finally, we must also understand the content of the domain. And by content, I don't just mean like content-rich pages, but also all of the information that you must share with the people who will be interacting in that environment so that the system makes sense to them, so that they can find things and understand them. Once we've done this research, we can then create what is called a conceptual model. And a model allows us to explore key distinctions and the relationships between them in the abstract, which is very important, right? It's very important that we consider how these things might relate to each other. Like, what are the main things? What are the main groupings, the main elements and groupings that need to be part of this experience, and how do they relate to each other? So in this example here, I've sketched out a very high-level conceptual model for the part of the bank's website that allows you to pay your credit cards, right? And the conceptual model doesn't look like an artifact that you would interact with. It's more abstract than that, but it informs those artifacts, right? And ultimately, these distinctions that we define in the conceptual model get expressed through things like labels, the little words that we pepper around the UI that let people know where they are and what they can do there. They get expressed as navigation systems, which are the equivalent of those openings on the wall in the restaurant example and the labels above the opening, right? They're the parts of the environment that let us move to other parts of the environment. And of course, the choices in the navigation system are expressed as labels for the most part. So all of these elements are interrelated. They get expressed through search systems. Search is a hugely important part of how people find stuff online, and it's well within the remit of what information architects do. It gets expressed through elements that aren't as easy to capture in a screenshot because they're mostly invisible. So things like metadata and controlled vocabularies, which go on to inform things like the search results and the way that various algorithms treat the content items that your system is offering to users. And all of these things, labels, navigation elements, search, and these invisible systems have to be designed, and they have to be designed in collaboration with other folks. And that is finally where things like sitemaps come in. But sitemaps aren't the only means we use to convey our intent when establishing an information architecture. There are many other artifacts, right? So I've already spoken about conceptual models. There are also mental models. If you've seen Indy Young's book on that subject, you will know what I'm talking about. There are journey maps that allow us to track how people interact with the system over time. There are sitemaps or flow maps, as we've talked about. There are content models, which are different from conceptual models, and implementation models, which engineers care a lot about. There are various types of prototypes that range from high to low fidelity. There are lots of office type docs, right? So a lot of our work ends up manifesting as spreadsheets and slide decks. So these are all means that we use to convey intent. So the sitemap is not the information architecture. The sitemap is a manifestation of the information architecture. It's one of many. And in my mind, not even the most important. And the more important thing is that we keep in mind that what we're looking to do is to establish a set of meaningful distinctions that create an environment that makes it possible for people to find stuff and to understand it once they've found it, right? And our understanding shifts as we locate stuff and become more versed in the language and conceptual distinctions of the domain that we're dealing with. One final word about this is that all of these things that we're talking about are works in progress. So an information architecture is never fully realized. It's always evolving because the systems that we're dealing with are dynamic and complex, and they're always evolving themselves. So we must think of these things not as artifacts that are somehow fixed in stone, but artifacts that are going to continue changing over time. And it's very important when we establish an information architecture that we think about the governance structures that are going to keep the information architecture relevant. And this is something that I find folks often miss. They think, well, you know, we need the IA because we're going to move on to creating the visual design or the UI or whatever. And they believe that the IA is somehow done. But the IA is never truly done, right? And the things that you learn, even within the context of a single project, when you manifest these structural distinctions as UI and you put them in front of people, you're going to learn things about the IA. Some things might work better than others. the distinctions that you may have thought are very clever and clear might not play well with either very users who are either very new to the domain or users who are very experienced in the domain, and you find yourself having to tweak them. So this is constantly evolving. And it's important that we acknowledge that and that we think about how the systems that we're designing are going to change over time, and that we create the correct foundations for the system to evolve in a coherent way. What you want is for it to continue serving its purposes over time. And those purposes are not just the the specific business purposes of the team or organization who is developing this thing and putting it into the world. Those businesses, those organizations exist within broader contexts. And the system that you're creating is going to influence those contexts as well. So thinking about how the system changes the business and the business changes the world is certainly within the remit of what we must be thinking about as information architects. And we should aspire for these things to stand the test of time. So I'm going to recap here so that we can then open things up if we have a few minutes. Information architecture matters more today than ever before. And this is because, like Andreessen said, software is eating the world. But what that specifically means is that software is becoming not just the tools that we use in this world, it's also becoming the places where we interact, right? So we have to approach it as though we are not just creating products and services, but we are creating places. And information architecture matters more than ever in creating places that serve our needs, not just at the organizational level, but more broadly. IA is not just about sitemaps, as we have said. It's broader than that. Sitemaps are a manifestation. And what it boils down to is making things more findable and understandable. And this requires that we bridge these imperfect, incomplete mental models that our users bring to the interaction with these conceptual models that the system must manifest for it to do its job, which can sometimes be very complex. This requires that we explore design more abstractly, right, with things like conceptual models. But we also have to use more tangible artifacts because we have to be able to convey those abstractions in ways that people can understand. And finally, the work doesn't end when the project wraps. So think about how it might evolve in the long term so that it preserves coherence and continues to serve its needs well after the team or the project has finished. All right, so that's what I have for you today. I hope that this has been helpful. And I believe that we're close to time, but if you have any questions or comments and we can't get to them here, please do reach out. Here's my email, and I'm also on Twitter. So thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you so much, and thanks to the audience for playing along with the pictures and things. Jorge, thank you so much, and you're getting some thanks in the chat room. Of course, we have a couple of minutes for questions if anybody wants to ask them. Otherwise, we'll wrap this meeting up. And lots of thanks. I hope you're looking at the chat room. Lots of gratitude.
Yeah,
thanks to you. And everybody, I just want to warn you, we are having continued Zoom issues. Check AirMeet for any updates. I will put the link in the let's see, the chat room to where you can hang out with us in the AirMeet. I will try to make announcements there about anything going on with Zoom and check the schedule. But I'm in a chat with support, and they seem to think they said someone will get back to me in 72 hours. So I might not have this fixed. I'm doing the best I can. But for now, I'll wrap this session up with, again, double thanks to Jorge and of course, our live typist. And I will catch everybody at the top of the hour with Samantha Evans. Thanks again.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.